2 Corinthians chapter 3 from New King James Version. Do we begin again to commend ourselves, to pat ourselves on the back? Or do we need, as some others, epistles of commendation to you, or letters of commendation from you? You are our epistle written in our hearts, known and read by all men. Clearly, you are an epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart. So Paul's saying, do we have to write a letter to tell how good you are, to give some kind of testimony of your works, of our faith in the direction you're headed? Do I need you to write me a letter and tell how much you approve of my work? He says our work is evident. People can see what we do. They can see what I do. They can see what you do. And I think he's more importantly pointing at them, the Corinthian church. And he's just saying that your works are evidence of the grace of God in your heart. And he makes a comparison here to the Old Testament, the Old Covenant also. He says you are not written with ink. See, the comparison is the Old Covenant was a law written down in black and white. Do this and don't do that in order to be justified. But the New Covenant is drastically different. It's exactly opposite. Some people want to view the New Covenant as just a new set of rules, a new set of do's and don'ts. But you shouldn't view it that way. The Old Covenant was a law of death and sin because nobody could keep the law. When he says, in order to be justified, you have to do these things and don't do these things, and then you'll be justified. Well, you may do some of those things, but you have to do all of them to be perfect. And nobody was able to do that except Jesus. So that's why the Old Covenant law, the Jewish law, was a law of death, because there was no grace. It was do it or die. And that's why the New Covenant is so great, because we are no longer under a set of written rules of do and don't. We are under the law of grace in the New Covenant. It says it's written on tablets of the flesh, that is the heart. The law of God is written on the heart, and that was prophesied about in the Old Covenant. He says he will write his law on your hearts. I wanted to go find at least one of the Old Covenant prophecies that says this in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 33. It says, "But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again, each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sins I will remember no more." So that's a good example, Jeremiah 31, verse 33 and following, of the prophecy of the New Covenant. The difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, where God's going to say, I will put my word on their hearts, and I will even give them knowledge of who I am. So if you know who God is, it's not because some man taught you. It's because God put it on your heart. Christians and people who go to church are offended at the idea that God would actually impart wisdom and knowledge to one person. Well, that's fine, but they can't stand the idea that he doesn't give to everybody equally. And if he doesn't give if he gives me any wisdom, why did he choose not to give another person wisdom? And they're thinking about it the wrong way. God doesn't owe anybody anything. And if he gives anybody a blessing, then that is a good thing. He doesn't owe anybody, and no one deserves any wisdom or knowledge or grace. But he chooses some freely to give gifts so that they can recognize the blessings that God gives. And we have such trust through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves. So there again, you're not sufficient of yourself. You have no wisdom, knowledge, understanding, faith, health, anything, children, money, house. You have nothing because you earned it yourself. But our sufficiency is from God, who also made us sufficient as ministers of the new covenant. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Again, talking about the old covenant law, the letter kills. Whenever there is a law given, then that law always results in punishment. Is there any law, even in America, is there any law that has ever been written, there probably is, that no one has ever been punished for? There's a law for speeding, and I can tell you, I've gotten a speeding ticket. There's a law for stopping at stop signs, and I can tell you, I've got a ticket for stopping at stop signs. There's a law for having two headlights, and I've been pulled over by the cops for a headlight being out. I don't think I've ever gotten a ticket, but I've at least been pulled over for it. So you don't have laws unless you have a punishment for breaking the law. And that's the way the old covenant was. A lot of people want to view the old covenant as the greatest blessing for any nation in those times. And I think that it was a punishment and a curse because it was a law that killed. It was a law of death. If you committed adultery, there was no forgiveness for that. You got stoned. You got killed. And even more minor things than that. The punishment was death for, I'm making this up, but like if you just didn't show hospitality to a stranger, it's like, oh man, that was, maybe you'd die for that. I don't know. But that's the way. Now, some people want to say, yeah, but God made all those food laws to actually protect them and keep them safe and healthy because they would get sick if they didn't follow the food laws. Well, there may be some truth to that, but at the same time, it was restrictive and limiting. And did they really have that much greater food preservation techniques in the first century as compared to the times before? I doubt it. But you could eat pigs in the first century, but not prior to that. You couldn't eat pigs. So the new covenant says the letter kills. The old covenant, the law of Moses, is a law of death. And Paul gives all credit to God for all blessings that he has and for even who he is. His sufficiency is from God. He can't claim to have anything of himself. We don't give ourselves wisdom, knowledge, understanding, or even faith in Christ. We can't know who God is unless God tells us who he is. And even though he's told us in the scriptures, you can read the scriptures and still not know who he is because he has to open your mind and heart to the truth. But if the ministry of death, that means the law of Moses, written and engraved on stones, again the law of Moses, if it was glorious, and it was, so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of the glory of his countenance, which glory was passing away. So again, Even when Moses was getting the law from God on the Mount Sinai, couldn't think of the name of it. When he came back down from the mountain, his face was glowing so much. They said, "Put a veil on, Moses, because your face is shining and it's blinding us." Even when he got the law, it says it was passing away. That glory was passing away, which means it was always intended to be temporary. That was the intent from the beginning. It was something that was supposed to lead you to a certain place, lead you to be prepared and ready for the things that were to come. Specifically, I believe one of the main reasons for the Old Covenant law of Moses was to convince people that they could not be saved by obedience. You cannot be saved by obeying any law, because if salvation is dependent on obedience to law, then every one of us will fail, and no one will be saved. So that's how it was a tutor. The law was a tutor to bring you to Christ, because you had to recognize your insufficiency. You had to recognize that your hopelessness, that you had no hope of salvation as long as salvation is dependent on your obedience, because even if you can obey in one point, you fail in another. And so it was glorious in that sense, that it had a valuable lesson to teach people. You can't be saved by obedience. And it was temporary from the get-go. How will the ministry of the Spirit not be more glorious? For if the ministry of condemnation had glory, there you go. Again, the law of Moses is called the ministry of condemnation, because whenever there's a law, you're going to fail and you're going to be condemned. The ministry of righteousness exceeds much more in glory, for even what was made glorious had no glory in this respect, because of the glory that excels. So everyone could recognize the glory of the Old Covenant. They could see the shining face of Moses after he had talked with God and he had came down from the mountain with the tablets of stone. This was clearly a God-approved law. God ordained it. God established it. God enforced it. Therefore, it was a glorious law. It was always intended to be temporary, and its main purpose was to lead you to Christ. And he's saying the glory of the new covenant is so much more glorious than the old covenant that it seems like the old covenant has no glory at all. And that's my perspective. When you look back at the law of Moses from the perspective of being a Christian, you say it has no glory at all compared to the glory of the new covenant. And that's my perspective. So I know I'm not going, the only way I would defend the old covenant is that it was a God-approved, God-ordained, it was God's will to do it that way. But I am so thankful that I don't live under those times, because I don't want to be held accountable to obeying a huge list of restrictive laws. I want to be free. I love the liberty that we have in Christ. And so that is so much more glorious in the new covenant than what they lived under in the old covenant. And, it makes me think of Psalm 118, I believe it is, or 119, when David was talking about how he loves the law. Well, that's the only thing he knew. And it was a God-ordained way that David was supposed to live. So you really have no choice but to be thankful for the times that you live in, for the only thing that you know, and especially that since you know that is God's will and God's law. Of course. Love it, David. But if David lived now, he would look back at the old covenant and say, man, the new covenant is so much more glorious than the old covenant that I lived under. For even what was made glorious had no glory in this respect, because of the glory that excels. For if what is passing away was glorious, what remains is much more glorious. Therefore, since we have such hope, we use great boldness of speech, unlike Moses, who put a veil over his face so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the end of what was passing away. So, I think for the rest of Moses' life after he got the 10 commandments down from Mount Sinai, I believe he wore a veil the rest of his life because his face glowed, and they couldn't stand to look at him because it was too bright. It was offensive. It was so the Jews couldn't even look at Moses. He had to put a cloth over his face to block how bright his face glowed. But their minds were blinded. And you need to soak that in. Their minds were blind. That's kind of what I just said about David. David praised the law in Psalm 119, but he had no vision of what the new covenant was like. He was blinded. He couldn't see what he didn't experience. It was not, so he was blinded. He was prevented. Now, blinded means, well, I want to say that blinded means that God was the one who blinded them, and really I think that's the way it was. God prevented them from seeing the liberty in Christ because it wasn't time for that. For until this day the same veil remains unlifted in the reading of the Old Testament, because the veil is taken away in Christ. So even the Jews of the first century, when they didn't believe in Jesus, or even Gentiles, anybody, but really the Jews would be the ones reading the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, the law of Moses. Jews would be doing that. So if anybody reads the Old Covenant and doesn't recognize that the purpose for the Old Covenant was to bring you to Christ, to point to Christ, to prophesy of the Messiah, to lead you to the kingdom of Christ, where we had liberty in Christ and no longer restricted and bound by the Jewish laws. Anyone who doesn't recognize that purpose for the Old Covenant still has a blinders on, still has a veil covering something that is not as glorious as what you could see, I guess, without the veil, because the veil is taken away in Christ. Whenever you, so I guess when you cover a light with a sheet or a cloth, it blocks the light. But whenever you understand Jesus is the purpose for all of it, then Jesus takes away that cloth, and then the glory of the light gets to shine. But even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil lies on their heart. Nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Now that is a very important verse, because, you say, just look at churches today. I think you can apply this to churches today. You have a church that preaches, laws and commandments and restrictions, and don't do this and don't do that. Women can't wear pants, and you can't go to the movies. You can't drink any alcohol under any circumstance. All these things that people come up with. I mean, you look at the Catholic Church and look at all their restrictions. People can't marry. They can't eat certain meats. But I mean, a lot of churches, most churches are probably this way, preaching a bunch of laws and restrictions that are not specifically, because the laws of the New Covenant are essentially love God and love your neighbor. All things are lawful. Nothing is wrong in and of itself. I used to, you can't get a tattoo, and then try to search through the Bible and pull up some old covenant scriptures and then use some new covenant things. Says, your body's the temple, and you wouldn't put a tattoo on the temple. Now, I don't have tattoos, and I don't drink alcohol. I mean, I taste it from time to time, but I don't like it. But that's my choice. I don't do it because there's a law against it. I do it because I just don't want to do it. I don't smoke cigarettes because I don't want my lungs to be turned to ashes. But it's not because there's a godly law against it. It's because I choose not to do it. But where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So, and also people love liberty. And if a church was taught liberty, then I think they would be growing more, and there would be evidence that the Spirit of the Lord was there. So wherever there is liberty, wherever there is freedom, that's where the Spirit is, because the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. So we are being transformed into this, from one level of glory to a higher level of glory. We are being transformed. I believe that would apply to us today also. I believe it applies to believers, to Christians in general, because we're going to go from this glorious state of human believers into a much more glorious state in the spiritual realm after our physical body dies and our spirit goes to the heavenly realm. That would be the much more glorious position. In the same way that you started with this fleshly law of Moses, which was a law of condemnation, which even had a glory, a certain level of glory, not just a certain level, but a high level. It had a high level of glory. But the new covenant is so much more glorious than the old covenant that it makes the old covenant look like it had no glory at all. And I believe that same idea carries with when you say, well, does this life have any glory associated with it? Do you recognize any blessings in this life with your family, your wife, your kids, whatever it is that you enjoy in this life? Is there a glory to that? Certainly. But what will the glory be like when we are transformed into the spiritual realm? It'll be so much more that when we look back on this, we would certainly not want to come back to it. So I don't know exactly what heaven is going to be like, but I know it's going to be great, and I want to go and I want to experience it. And I really don't think there's a lot in the scriptures to describe it. Revelation 22 or something talks about this foundation in the city with all these different jewels, but I don't think that's literal. And I really wouldn't care if the city was gold or silver or had onyx or pearls or whatever. I don't care what it looks like. So that's what faith is. Faith is the substance of, what does it say? Hebrews. Anyway, it's hoping for something that you can't see. So that completes 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I think is a real good chapter on comparing the glory of the old covenant with the glory of the new covenant. So like and subscribe. Put your comments down below. Let's study the Bible together.